Good morning. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this, our annual commemoration, where we honor and think about the great Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and all that he did for this country and this world and relationships between people of different races. We come together to remind ourselves that, as Martin Luther King said, the arc of history is long, but it does bend toward justice.
I am really delighted to introduce the moderator for today's program, Dr. Alicia Bonaparte. Currently serving as Associate Professor of Sociology at Pitzer College, Dr. Bonaparte's research is focused on the healthcare disparities in African American communities. Her most recent book, Birthing Justice: Black Women, Pregnancy, and Childbirth, highlights a global crisis in maternal health care for Black women. As a nationally acclaimed medical sociologist, Dr. Bonaparte is routinely sought after to present at conferences and to provide talks to colleagues, physicians, and other medical professionals throughout the country. If you just do a simple Google search of her name, you'll reveal countless quotes in articles, manuscripts, NPR News, and so forth. Professor Bonaparte received her bachelor's degree in sociology from Spelman College and her master's and PhD in sociology from Vanderbilt University. In 2016, Dr. Bonaparte and I were chosen to attend a conference in Washington, D.C., examining the intersections of free speech, campus protests, and the courts. And it was at that conference that Dr. Bonaparte and I first met Dr. Tatum. When the college approached Dr. Tatum about serving as our event speaker and we discussed the possibility of a moderated program, the choice of the moderator was an easy one. Dr. Bonaparte has been a long follower of Dr. Tatum's work, and their collective research on issues of race were a natural fit. While California is where she lives, Augusta, Georgia is her home. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Dr. Alicia Bonaparte.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. I am excited right now. Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, it is truly an honor to be present on the stage with you in conversation. For those who may be unfamiliar with your work, please allow me to introduce why LaGrange College is very much so honored for you to be here with us today. Dr. Tatum holds a BA in psychology from Wesleyan University, an MA and a PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Michigan, and an MA in religious studies from Hartford Seminary. Dr. Tatum is the former president of my alma mater, Spelman College. In fact, she was the 9th president of Spelman, and after serving 13 years as president, is now president emerita of Spelman College. Her tenure there included such vast improvements on a social as well as a physical level that she was awarded the Carnegie Academic Leadership Award in 2013. Prior to serving Spelman, Dr. Tatum held positions at the University of California, Santa Barbara, Westfield State University, and Mount Holyoke College, where she was dean and acting president. Her varied publications include journal articles and publications like Daedalus, Harvard Educational Review, and Teachers College Record. And she has award-winning books such as Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And Other Conversations About Race, which in 2017 has its 20th anniversary edition, Assimilation Blues, Black Families in White Communities, Who Succeeds and Why, and Can We Talk About Race and Other Conversations in an Era of School Resegregation. You would think after such accomplishments, she might take a break. Yet, she continues to be at the forefront of addressing racial issues as a licensed clinical psychologist and workshop facilitator for discussions around racial identity development and inclusive environments as a central authority on such topics for campuses and businesses alike. A few of her career awards include being the 2014 recipient of the American Psychological Association Award for Outstanding Lifetime Contributions to Psychology, receiving the prestigious Brock International Prize in Education in 2005 for her innovative leadership in the field, and she was also the recipient of the Mimi and Peter E. Haas Distinguished Visitor at Stanford University in 2017. I'm hopeful that today's conversation will continue to elaborate her point, which is, quote, there's a lot of unlearning that has to happen in order for young people to engage effectively with each other. and we need to be creating opportunities for that learning to take place on campuses. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum.
Good morning, everyone.
So let's begin with question number 1. Let me place my reading glasses back on. Okay. So, how do you think your work relates to the current social political climate around education reform?
Well, let me start by, first of all, I want to thank everyone for coming. I am, you heard that I dashed through some rain to get here, but I know you all walked through some rain to get here, and I appreciate the fact that so many people are here. And certainly I want to thank President McAlexander for such a warm welcome. So thank you, and to Dr. Carlisle as well. When we think about education reform as a category, you know, why do people talk about education reform? They talk about education reform because they think, or they want, we all want, to see better educational outcomes. We want our students to be able to go to high quality public schools and be able to leave those schools ready for college and or career. And for a lot of students, particularly black and brown students, that is not the case. So how do we fix that? That's the question that many people are asking. My work around understanding the psychology of racism and how racism operates in our society is directly connected to that if we understand the history of education in the United States. And here we sit in Georgia, you know, today we like to think of, I live in Atlanta, I like to think of Atlanta as a very progressive community and a place where there's lots of opportunity, but even Atlanta is a place where there's very little economic mobility for people who were born poor. If you are black and poor living in Atlanta today, the odds are you're going to die black and poor, and so will your children, in terms of the opportunity to move up. When we look at a city like Atlanta, we see that there are lots of African Americans doing very well, but the truth is most of those people came to Atlanta from someplace else. They weren't educated in Atlanta and then able to succeed. And that may be true in other parts of the state as well. So when we think about how our schools are structured and the way in which students are tracked into opportunity, whether that's, you know, the kinds of opportunity expectations that are built into school districts, how resources are allocated, and if we look at the legacy of segregation, we know that there is schools that are still highly segregated are likely to have fewer resources, not just in terms of physical facilities and books and those kinds of resources, but more likely to have inexperienced teachers assigned to that school, more likely to see high teacher turnover. All of those things contribute to the quality of the education that they receive. And I like to talk about the history of education because often when we look at contemporary problems, we tend to talk about them as though they just happened randomly, as opposed to really being, if we understand our history, recognizing the intentional structure into which students enter. So if we want to change the outcomes, I think we have to acknowledge that history and look at how our current practice can interrupt those past structures. If we don't do that, we're not likely to be successful.
So as a sociologist, I couldn't help but think about a whole bunch of relevant sociological terms, right?
Yes.
And in particular, there was this concept that we've started to move away from. That concept is intergenerational poverty.
Yes.
And most oftentimes people don't like it anymore because it assigns blame to people and it says, you are the reason why you continue to be poor.
Right.
It's one of the reasons why I love Catherine Newman's work in which she talks about the concept of interrupted mobility, right? Mm-hmm. And instead, and I think you talk about this extensively in your own work as well, this idea of there are social structures that are in place, right?
Yes.
And that those social structures then lend themselves to why we see a lack of resources happening. Mm-hmm. I know for myself sometimes I think about education reform and I think about what is it called, Teach for America.
Yes.
And the fact that it's designed, right, to engage in forms of education reform. And I was just wondering before when you were talking about inexperienced teachers, like, do you think that that could potentially be a part of this as well?
So in the spirit of full disclosure, I served on the board of Teach for America for a number of years. And I say that to say, and so people who know my work will often ask me, why did you do that? And I am very clear about why I did that, and I'll tell you, as a Spelman alum, you will appreciate the fact that many students at Spelman sign up for Teach for America. And in fact, there was a time when Teach for America was one of the #1 employers of Spelman grads. And in the pipeline, and I'm sure people in the audience know, Teach for America is a program that recruits talented college students and encourages them to explore teaching as a leadership development opportunity. And many people are critical, as I have been myself, of Teach for America, because if the offer that Teach for America is making is come teach for 2 years and then go on and do the next thing, right? And that's not really helpful for students to have an inexperienced teacher for 2 years who's then moving on to something else. That said, because I was on the board, well, so you might say, well, why'd you join the board? Because so many Spelman students were joining Teach for America. I wanted to be on the board to make Teach for America a better organization. And I think I was helpful in doing that in the 9 years that I served as a board member. And one of the things that I learned while I was serving on the board of Teach for America was that Teach for America is in some ways the #1 pipeline of teachers of color. So we all want more teachers of color, and what we find is that Teach for America is recruiting heavily Black and Latinx undergrads, many of whom decide to stay in education. So even though the offer is for 2 years, many people stay beyond. And surprisingly, perhaps, those students, because they are selected for their leadership capacity, enter classrooms and actually turn out to be quite successful. Some of the, percentages of teachers of the year are actually TFA graduates, and they go on to be principals and superintendents, et cetera. So while I think there's a flaw in the proposition, 2 years and then go on, the reality is a high percentage of Teach for America recruits actually stay in education. So it has turned out to be a pretty successful recruitment tool in that sense. So it's kind of a mixed bag in that way. But having said that, I think what we have to recognize is that high-need students need more than just an enthusiastic teacher.
Exactly.
They need skill and they need resources. I am working with a project in Atlanta that is focused on an elementary school, a turnaround elementary school, which is a public school. It's not a charter school. It's called Hollis Innovation Academy. And we're seeing great progress. But one of the things that the principal said she needed at the very beginning when the school first opened, it's been open about 4 years, in a very high poverty district, where students were reading single digit, like third grade, the students who were entering that school when it first opened, the third graders, only 6% of them were reading proficiently. So that just gives you a sense of, the heavy lifting that needs to happen to get kids ready for the next phase of their education. And when we talked to the principal, what she said she needed was an extra teacher in every classroom. And we were able to raise money to make that happen for her. So she now has been able to cut the classroom size in half by having that extra person, the ratio, the teacher-student ratio, by having that teacher in the classroom. And that has clearly demonstrated, we can see clearly demonstrated improved student performance for lots of good reasons. But I want to come back to that comment you were making about intergenerational poverty and the implied blame in that term. And when you were speaking about that, I was thinking about Dr. McAlexander's comments about Dr. King, because in 2018, that was the 50th anniversary or the commemoration of his assassination in 1968. I had the opportunity to participate in a panel in Memphis on the legacy of Dr. King. And as the audience will recall, of course, he was assassinated in Memphis, but he was in Memphis at that time because he was organizing a march or participating in a march with the sanitation workers in Memphis for better pay, better working conditions. 50 years later, those sanitation workers were still advocating for a living wage, right? Still pushing for $15 an hour, which is the agreed upon living wage in the region. And there was a colleague on the panel with me who said, people are poor because they're paid poorly. And I think that that is a really important point for us to understand, that most poor people are working. Most poor people have a job, but they're in a job that pays them $7 an hour. And it's very difficult to earn to pay your rent, to take care of your kids, to have high quality food, and all of those things when you're paid so little. And we might think about why we as a nation think it's okay to pay people such a small amount of salary to do anything.
Right.
When I was president, I used to say, if we have a job on our campus that we need somebody to do, we need to pay them a living wage. If it's a job we need doing, then the person who does it ought to be able to earn enough to have it ought to be paid a living wage, and that's what we did at Spelman. But I think it's really important for us to think about how our society is structured in that way. I, not long ago, read a book about the history of slavery. Around the time of the 1619 anniversary that was being marked in the summer, and the New York Times did a special edition looking at the legacy of slavery in today's times. And I, of course, was very interested in that, but I read a book called The Half Has Never Been Told, which is the subtitle. I'm not going to get it exactly right. I'm not going to remember the detail of it, but the subtitle is something like Slavery and the Making of Modern Capitalism. And what was striking about listening to that book, I listened to it as an audiobook. What struck me as I was listening to that book was that there was a lot of detail, but it was very clear that as slavery evolved as a economic system, the goal was to get as much out of the worker as possible for as little as possible, right? Whether that was, and there was a lot of detail about systems put in place to increase the speed with which workers picked cotton, and and a lot of that was brutality, of course, whipping and that kind of stuff. But the goal was to, as the quality of the land deteriorated from over farming, it became increasingly important to extract as much out of the soil and the product as you could, the goal being as much profit as possible, as little investment as possible. And the author makes the argument that that economic structure has carried over into our contemporary society, where it is still our goal to extract as much profit as possible for as little investment as possible in terms of the human capital that we use. And so while, of course, we don't have slavery in that sense, we still have lots of industries where the goal is to pay the people working in that industry as little as possible. And that's a problem.
I can't help but think about Charles H. Johnson's work. And in particular, he created this term called the plantation economy.
Yes.
So as I was listening to you, and Charles H. Johnson, for those of you who don't know, is a very well-known black sociologist. And he purposely studied race relations in the South. And he was trying to determine why is it that you have these very poor black people living in this small county in Alabama in which their economic situation has not shifted at all, even though this is post-emancipation.
Yes.
And one of the things that he noted was exactly what you're talking about, this pay scale that was in essence keeping people subservient to their former plantation owners, right?
Yes.
And the other thing I was thinking about too is you had mentioned the term tracking, and I know sometimes people know that term and sometimes people don't.
Yes.
One of the things I wanted to highlight really quickly is there's a series of studies that actually talk about how when tracking happens really early based upon literacy scores, that these are individuals, typically young black and brown boys, that end up being in the juvenile justice system and then later the larger criminal justice system.
Yes.
And so as I was listening to you, I couldn't help but think about how these systems start so early,
Yes.
right? So start so early. And then I also think about the conversations that you speak of with your own children when they were young,
Yes.
and thinking about their ideas about race and things of that sort. So I was hoping we could potentially segue into another question, if that's
Yes,
okay with
please.
you. Okay. So what current struggles do you believe educators have working with students seeking to understand the role of racial identity in social bonding?
Well, I think the challenge talking about race in classrooms, whether those are elementary classrooms, middle school classrooms, high school classrooms, or college classrooms, is that the adults in the room, meaning the instructors, right? The adults in the room are uncomfortable with those conversations. So it's very difficult to help people understand that which we're not talking about, right? And so I think it might be worthwhile to just spend a moment with this audience talking about why that conversation is so challenging. I always like to ask a few questions, if I might, and so I can't see you all very well because of the lights, but I'm going to ask this question anyway, which is to say, take a minute and think about your own earliest race-related memory. And I know there's students in the room, and there are non-students, maybe some faculty, maybe some community members, so it's a generational mix of people. But raise your hand if you have thought of something. Nobody's going to ask you what it is, just so you know, there's no risk. Raise your hand if you've thought of something. It looks like most people have their hands up. And so now I'd like to know how old you were at the time of the thing you remembered. And you can do this in one of two ways. You can either hold up your hand, like if you were 5, hold up 5 fingers, or you can call out some ages.
10, 8, 9, 7, 5, 4.
I got 8 over here? Yes. Okay, so I heard as young as 4. I heard as old as 14. Anybody younger than 4? Okay, I think there's a hand back there, maybe 3. Anybody older than 14 for your earliest memory? I can't really see. So there's some hands over there. How old? 20. Yes, okay. And there's no right answer to this question. Of course, it's a highly individualized question. It has everything to do with where you grew up and the social context in which you were. But I now want to ask, and this will require verbal participation because you can't use your hands, and that is to say, what emotion is associated with the experience that you remember? Anger, I heard anger, confusion, fear, anxiety, frustration, confusion. I think I heard somebody say hurt. So let me just repeat the ones I've heard so far. Anger, fear, confusion, frustration, hurt. Anything else you want to add to that list?
Curiosity.
Curiosity. Disbelief. Fear. Shame. Okay, so with the possible exception of curiosity, which we might describe as a neutral word or maybe even a positive thing to be curious about something, most of the words are words that we would associate with discomfort, right? Anger, fear, shame, hurt, confusion. All of those, and I may have left some of those words out, but you get the gist. These are words that are generally associated with discomfort. So this is another hand-raising opportunity. I'd like to know if at the time of your thing that you remembered, again, now nobody's going to ask you what it is, if at the time of the thing you remembered, raise your hand if you had a conversation about it with a concerned adult, a parent or a teacher, somebody like that. Raise your hand if you did. Okay, so it looks like maybe there's a few, maybe a dozen hands, not more, maybe 20. Raise your hand if you did not. Raise them high so we can see them with the light shining on us. Okay, so it's pretty clear to me that there are more did nots. And that is true in every audience I speak to. It's always the case that there are many more people who did not have that conversation than the people who did. So now I'd like to know, so as I said, we had a range from like 3 to 20, but if we were graphing the ages, most people are usually somewhere in early elementary school. First, second, third grade, something like that. Raise your hand if you were in elementary school when your thing happened. Okay, a lot of you. So how many of you know 6 and 7-year-olds? You know, maybe you've got a nephew, a sibling, a relative, your own children. Okay, most of you have had some experience with 6 and 7-year-olds. And here's what I'm going to tell you about them, speaking as a psychologist. They tell you everything, right? They don't filter much, right? They just kind of blurt stuff out. They ask embarrassing questions when you don't expect it. And so we know that about young children. They don't have the social filters that they get as they get older. And yet, in this audience of, more than 100 people, we find that there are people who were said, I was that age when you don't filter much. And yet, I didn't talk about this thing that made me anxious or fearful or angry or hurt or ashamed or confused. And so you have to ask the question, why not? Right? I mean, it's counterintuitive, right? So why not? And I think the answer to that question is that we learn at a very early age the adults in our environment do not want to talk about this. That sometimes people will say, well, the adult was the confusing person, right? It was the adult who said or did the thing that led me to feel angry or upset. But even if that's not the case, most people will say, I just knew, maybe it would be embarrassing for me to talk about this, or it would get me in trouble, or I just knew I wasn't supposed to talk about it. So fast forward to the college classroom, since we're here at a college, and what we find is that you've got a room full of students who have learned from an early age, don't talk about these things. Don't talk about it, and if you do, it will make me feel angry, afraid, confused, upset. All those emotions are going to come back. And it's not just the students who have that feeling. It's the faculty members or the staff members who also have to work against that socialization. And that's part of the challenge, that we have all colluded with a culture of silence about this topic, particularly when we're in racially mixed settings, which makes it hard then, as I like to say, you can't fix something you can't talk about.
And the thing that's so interesting, too, in listening to you and thinking about these types of feelings is that when there's a reading, right, that pushes students, and I know this for myself as a professor, I'll have students that will come after class and they'll say, I have never read anything by a Black author before, or you're my first Black professor that I've ever had. And there's a moment, for myself at least, that I would say is that I'm thinking to myself, how do I make this a learning moment without increasing this individual's shame, right? And also by reminding them there's a line that I have on my syllabus that says, this is a class that's not aimed towards blaming you for the misinformation that you received beforehand, but instead is about exposing you to other forms of analyses and thought as a way of expanding your mind. Whether you agree or you disagree doesn't matter to me, but I do think it's important for you to know.
Yes.
The other thing I was thinking about too is beyond just these levels of feelings that people have, whether they're the educator or the student, is also this question of, so what types of things can I have in the curriculum that help towards that? And I just want to highlight really quickly one of the things that you talk about in your book in talking about this need for positive critique, for example, right? So understanding and recognizing that some Black and brown and other students of color are looking for educators, right, to pointedly give them positive critique. So instead of being fearful that you're giving me something to make me feel bad and that I can't do better, instead you want me to be able to have academic achievement. So I'd like to move on to our last question.
Okay.
So, given the fact that we are celebrating Black History Month, it's very exciting, and I'm a nerd and I love books. So, my question to you, and I'm hoping there's a few nerds in the audience as well, what scholars or books do you feel are important to read in this current time in honor of Black History Month?
Well, so at the top of my list would be, for anyone in the audience, would be Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. Now, he wrote another book, which is really wonderful. Ibram Kendi is an African-American studies scholar, and he wrote a book for which he won a major award called Stamped from the Beginning, which is about how racism as an ideology, how racist ideas really got baked into our national narrative and reinforced across time, starting from before, going back to the 1500s. Up through the 21st century. And that's a really wonderful book, and particularly for history buffs, I would highly recommend that one. But he wrote another book called How to Be an Anti-Racist. And I think it's a really helpful book for people to think about, how do I, as an individual, think about what I can do to interrupt racism? Yeah. Now, I would also add my own book to that list, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? Because I also talk about what individuals can do to interrupt racism. But to use Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, which came out in the fall, just this past fall, so it's a relatively new book, and he has a wonderful analogy, which I think is really useful. He tells people, and I've heard him say this in interviews, so this is not a spoiler for his book, but he tells in the book, he writes about his own experience with cancer. He was diagnosed, he's a young person in his late 30s maybe, but he was diagnosed with a very serious case of cancer, and which he has survived and is now healthy, but he used a cancer analogy to talk about racism. I think that experience of going through his treatment for cancer gave him some insight. And he talks about racism in our society is kind of like cancer. And it is, I think. It is like a cancer in our society, sort of eating away at the fabric of our nation in ways that we ignore at our own peril. The president was talking about, president of LaGrange, I'm talking about here, Dr. Yes, just to clarify, in his introduction was talking about what a difficult time this is. And in some ways, I think it's a dangerous time. Yes. And if we think about, ignoring a cancer diagnosis, that's a dangerous thing to do, right? Puts your life at risk. But what Ibram Kendi talks about is that if we think of racism as like cancer, you want to detect it early, right? You want to detect it early and try to remove it. But once it's removed, let's imagine you've been successful in changing policies and practices that have disparate impact, and and you've worked on education and you see positive attitudes changing. I mean, attitudes becoming more positive and less bias in your systems. Let's imagine you've been successful at that. If you are a cancer survivor, one of the things you know is that you have to be vigilant to be sure it doesn't come back, right? And so he says, we need to diagnose our racism early. We need to try to address it. And if we feel like we've been successful, we still have to be vigilant about the fact that it could return. And if it does return, then we want to jump on it quick, right? And that is, I think, a great analogy for how we have to think about this issue in our society. There is an impulse, and I think we experienced this impulse at the time of President Obama's election. Yes. The impulse was to say, great, we're done now, right? We're in this post-racial society. We don't have to talk about these issues anymore. Everything's been fixed. Well, of course, we now understand that that was not the case, and that whatever we thought was fixed, we have experienced some regression. Dr. King, in his last book, which I highly recommend, I would put this on the list too, even though it is more than 50 years old now. His last book is called Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. It's a short book, published in 1968, but I think it's a really great book to read at this moment because I think at this moment we are facing a choice between chaos or community. And that's what Dr. King was writing about. And he said, you know, after every period of social progress, particularly in the area of race relations, after every period of social progress, he says in that book, there is a period of pushback, sort of a desire to push back to the status quo. And I think we can see that pattern operating right now, a period of social progress followed by a period of pushback against that progress. And at the end of the day, he says, you know, you can change laws, and when he was writing in the book was published in 68. The Voting Rights Act had passed in 1965. You know, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was what made it possible to, you know, desegregate lunch counters and hotels and all of that. So those were relatively recent law changes, legal changes, but at the same time, he was experiencing in 68 this pushback against those changes. Well, fast forward 50 years, we can point to lots of things that have changed for the good, but we can also see the pushback against those things. Even attacks on voting rights, right? You know, the legislature having to look at how to restore the elements of the Voting Rights Act that were essentially undone by the Supreme Court in 2013. So we have to look at that, and even though the language in Dr. King's book is dated, you know, he uses the term Negro, for example. That's not a commonly used term. He talks a lot about men this, men that, you know, as opposed to more gender-neutral language. But if we overlook those things, recognizing the fact that he was writing at a particular time, his ideas about what's needed to go forward, I think, are really powerful. And one of the things he says that we need to go forward is to really listen to one another. And to create greater empathy for those who are disenfranchised or disadvantaged by systems of racism. And that, I think, is really critical.
Thank you so much for giving us some wonderful reading list. At this time, we're actually going to open it up for questions.
Fabulous.
One of the things I'd like to ask for those of you who do intend to ask a question is if you could keep it brief and concise, given our time constraints.
My name is Bobby Hart. I'm part of a group called Truth Together, and we were part of facilitating the Austin Calloway apology. My question is, are you familiar with Dr. James Cone? Some call him the father of Black liberation theology.
I am.
We should recommend his work today, and
Well,
what are your thoughts?
Well, certainly I am familiar with Dr. Cohn's work, and let me just say, I think it might have been in my bio, I'm not sure, but I have a master's degree in religious studies from Hartford Seminary, and while I was a student at Hartford Seminary, we certainly read his work on Black liberation theology, and I would recommend. I mean, you know, there are lots of things that one can read that are more recently published, but those are classic texts, and I would recommend them. There's another book, while we're waiting for another question, that I would highly recommend, and that book is also relatively new, and it's called White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. And it's particularly written to a white audience. Anyone, of course, can read it, and I read it, but she is a white writer writing to her fellow white citizens about what it means to be white in the United States and how the ways in which many white people have been socialized interferes with their ability to engage in dialogue as effectively as they might like. And so for the person who's wondering, how can I get better at being part of cross-racial dialogue, for the white person who's wondering about that, or for the person of color who's wondering why it's so hard sometimes for white people, I think reading White Fragility answers a lot of those questions.
Hey, my name is Deja Potts, and I'm a freshman here at LaGrange College. And my question is, with the standards in like society and the standards in life, whether it's the standards of being a motivational speaker or standards in sports or standards here in college, there are also racial standards, meaning that when you are in a situation specifically, there's always a racial point of view. So my question would be, is there any tips or ideals that you believe would work when it comes to dealing with a racial point of view in a situation?
If I'm understanding what you mean by a racial point of view, do you mean racial bias that someone?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Okay. So when you enter into a situation, people may have lowered expectations based on your racial identification, or they might have stereotypes that they're projecting onto you. Yeah. So so the first thing I would say is what was said to me as I was growing up in a house with parents who were educators. Always do your best, right? Bring your A game. And if you are doing your best, it is certainly the case that there will be people who will be surprised by that, who will say, gosh, she's better at that than I was expecting. Someone might have that attitude. Or, you can't always control what other people think, but if you are doing your very best, you will be able in some ways to counteract those biases. But it's also important, I think, for all of us to acknowledge that biases are operating. And one of the things that when I'm working with employers, we talk about is how do we work against unconscious or implicit bias. And one way to do that is to slow the process down. Because we tend to rely on our stereotypes, we tend to rely on our misinformation when we're acting quickly. But if you can slow the process down, give people more time to interact with you, take more time with that resume. If you can slow the process down, you're less likely to operate from a place of bias. Okay, and our last question looks like.
My name's Taylor. So you talked earlier about how we have made, as a society, we've made great strides from where we were as far as racial equality, but we still have hurdles to overcome. What do you, in your opinion, what are the first steps in overcoming the obstacles that still lay in front of us?
I think the first step is to pay attention to them and acknowledge them, right? When if you can't name a problem, if you can't talk about it, if you can't acknowledge that it exists, then it becomes difficult to do something about it, right? So even if we're thinking about, for example, differential access to high quality education, we need to acknowledge that that's a problem and then try to address it. Sometimes when people want to say, and I hear people say these things, I do talks, and people will say, we have solved these problems. This is not an issue anymore. Now it's really up to individuals, and it's not about structural barriers. But the data shows otherwise, right? If we disaggregate, I'm sitting here with a sociologist. If we disaggregate the data, we see otherwise. Exactly. And if we are not willing to look at a problem, we can't solve it. So the first thing I would say is let's collectively look at it, name it for what it is, and then we can problem solve. Thank you for your question.
So I'd like to end by quoting you one more time.
Okay.
I have an article that's called Together and Alone, the challenge of talking about racism on campus. And you end there's a part of the article in which you say, quote, empathic contact must be created. It's not enough to be in the same neighborhood or even in the same room. It is necessary to create contact that all allows for genuine empathy across lines of difference if we are to reduce the barriers that King describes. I'd like to say thank you, number one, to Dr. Tatum, but also to each of you all for being here in the audience with us today. I'm also hopeful that each of you will engage in some shape, form, or fashion with Black History Month. And last but not least, I'd like to alert you all to the fact that Dr. Tatum will be signing copies of her text shortly after the program. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Have a nice day.
Thank you.